was one of the happiest decisions I ever made. I've been very impressed ever since by the warmth and the generosity and I won't say the tolerance because that would be patronizing, but the right spirit in which my challenge was greeted, most particularly and most early by Pastor Wilson, with whose co-authored work you will find fine bookstores are equipped everywhere, including here today. All right. Now there was another bestseller just before the First World War. Some of you may even have heard of it. It was a sensational bestseller in the English-speaking world. It was called When It Was Dark, and the author was a man called Guy Thorne. And the mise en scène of the novel is this, that archaeologists digging in the greater Jerusalem area come across a big round boulder and they roll it away, and there's a tomb behind it in the hill. And on the slab of the tomb is the really quite well-preserved cadaver of someone who has been badly scourged with a horrible whip, who's had nails driven through his hands and his feet, who has a terrible wound in his side, and who has a crown of thorns pressed down very hard on what's left of his scalp. And this is an absolutely certain discovery. Or so it is reported on the wires of the London Times, which first prints it, and then the story spreads around the world. And as the story spreads, darkness descends. People cease to care for their wives or their children. To coin a phrase from, I think, Lady Bracknell, they start doing it in the street and frightening the horses. They borrow and they don't return the money. They take money. They help themselves. There are no standards left. It's all over. Until it's revealed that this was a cruel hoax and imposture, probably a Jewish one. And the normality can be resumed. People are okay to behave well because the resurrection has not been disproved. Now, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that it's puerile to think that way, and servile too. That if it could be shown, as I cannot in fact, that the story is entirely, not just partially, but entirely legendary and mythical, I believe I could get quite close to doing that. I do not believe that any one of you would start behaving worse. I don't know you, but I love you as if you were my brothers and my sisters, as I am quite entitled to do without being in communion with you. And I have the feeling you could survive that news and still be decent to your friends and a great river of support and strength to your families, and still feel solidarity with other humans you hadn't even met, because you know that without that we couldn't have evolved and we couldn't survive as a species. And I submit that as a proper basis for ethical study, and in the belief that the proper study of mankind is man. I do think that Jesus was on the mythical verge of where history starts and prehistory ends. There will never be anything like conclusive proof, but I don't mind, because the more that the fabrication is uncovered, and many of the stories about him are known to have been untrue, the more one is impressed by people's wish that it be true at the time. And the more one feels that all this invention and all this fabrication wouldn't have been worth it if there'd never been any such person. Paradoxically, the more effort that goes into the myth, the more you think, well, maybe there was a King Arthur after all, that it isn't just legend. But that this person was the Son of God, and proves it by having a virgin for a mother and by being resurrected, these things are incoherent. Someone could have a virgin for a mother and not be the Son of God. Every prophet, every holy person ever born, right up to and including Kim Jong-il, has had miraculous scenes at the birth, usually involving the unlikelihood that the mother ever had a sexual intercourse. That's commonplace. Resurrections are repeatedly, Douglas sometimes describes them as resuscitations, to distinguish them, because these people go on to die again, but nonetheless
30 seconds.
Other people dying is known to have happened in the greater Jerusalem area at that time, or is asserted to do so. It might not prove anything on its own. All right, now I've really got to be quick. Does it do any good? In the last week, the Pope has gone to Africa and said AIDS may be bad, but condoms might be worse. The Archbishop of Canterbury has said, a man who, I don't know whether he's a shepherd or not, but he does a very good impersonation of a sheep, has said that Muslims in Britain should have Sharia law and the church should help them to install it, and the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow has become the official church of Vladimir Putin and his new dictatorship, and has started minting icons, actual icons with portraits of Stalin in them, to sell not just in Georgia as wonder-working and miraculous objects. And these are just only the three largest Christian denominations in the world, and I'm perfectly well aware that to many of you in this room, those people aren't really Christians at all. Hands up who doesn't think the Pope is a Christian. Or that the Greek Orthodox Pope is a Christian. Or that the Archbishop of Canterbury is really a spiritual leader. You're not putting up your hands, but you know who you are. And the fact that there's no agreement on who is or what is a Christian, or what it is to be one, is not my problem. And it's not by any means the least of yours. I've just mentioned some of the others. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Don't even think about it. You can laugh, you can cry. I try both. No clapping.
Okay. Bill Craig.
Okay, I want to begin by thanking Stan for the privilege of taking part in today's panel discussion, and to say how pleased I am to be on this panel with these other distinguished colleagues. A case for biblical Christianity can only be outlined in 4 minutes, so let me give you some of the reasons for why I believe in Christian theism. First of all, I think that God is the best explanation for why anything exists rather than nothing. This is the deepest question of metaphysics. And it seems to me an argument for God along these lines is valid and cogent. Whatever whatever exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or else in an external cause. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And the universe obviously exists. From that it follows that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then God exists. And since that first premise requires that, I think this is a good argument for God's existence that one could defend in more detail. Lee has also outlined another argument for God's existence based on the beginning of the universe, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Philosophical and scientific evidence shows the universe began to exist, from which it follows there is a transcendent cause of the universe beyond space and time, which brought the universe into being from nothing. Lee also mentioned the third argument that I would appeal to, the argument based on the fine-tuning of the universe. The fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. And I think it's plausible and improbable that it's due to either physical necessity or sheer chance, from which it follows that it's due to design. A fourth argument would be a moral argument that would run like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And by objective values, I mean values and duties which are obligatory and binding, independently of whether anybody believes them or not. I would argue, secondly, that objective moral values and duties do exist, that in moral experience we apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties, from which it follows necessarily and logically that therefore God exists. The ontological argument, I think, is also a sound argument for God. It shows that if the existence of God is even possible, then it follows that God exists. And the idea here is that God, by definition, is a maximally great being. There can be nothing greater than God. And a maximally great being would be a being which is omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect in every possible world. Well, now, if it's possible that there is a being like that, it follows that there is a possible world in which a maximally great being exists. But if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, it exists in all of them, including the actual world. Therefore, it follows that God exists. So if God's existence is even possible, it follows that God exists. The atheist would have to not merely deny that God exists, but that it's even possible for God to exist. I would also then argue, as Lee did, on the basis of Jesus' radical personal claims and his resurrection from the dead, that Jesus is a revelation of the Creator God of the universe that is apprehended through the arguments of natural theology, that the best explanation of the facts of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection is that God raised Jesus from the dead, and that therefore it follows that the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists. And finally, I would say that God can be known immediately through personal experience. Philosophers call beliefs of this kind properly basic beliefs. They're not based upon deeper inferences, rather they're foundational to a person's system of beliefs. These aren't arbitrary, rather they're grounded in experience. And that's what makes them properly basic. And I think for the person who knows God, who has a personal relationship with God, The belief that God exists is a properly basic belief grounded in his experience of God, and that therefore
30 seconds.
it is both rational and justified